Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you've had a nice, nutritious lunch and you're ready for Let Food Be Thy Medicine. Crystal did a great job of introducing the session, and just to add to that, so my name's Sharon Natoli. I'm an accredited dietitian and the founding director of Food and Nutrition Australia. I've been working with businesses and organisations across the food sector for the past 30 years now, helping them to identify the health and nutritional benefits of their food and translate that through into meaningful messages for consumers that are accurate and also compliant. We have a great panel this afternoon to discuss this topic of food and how it can contribute to our health and well-being. We know that that's really important. Obviously, food is a key driver of our health, and but despite the fact that research shows 83% of consumers globally know that and feel that diet and nutrition is important for their health, we still have a big challenge ahead. The Global Nutrition Report that came out in 2017 found that if we continue the way we are, we only have a 1% chance of reaching global targets around obesity and diabetes by 2025. So there's a high level of interest in what we eat, and there's a high level of knowledge around knowing that that has an influence on our health. But clearly there's a bit of a missing link in terms of how that translates through into behaviour change. So we're going to discuss some of the solutions, I guess, some of the problems and some of the solutions that we can achieve through better nutrition and food, even doing more perhaps from a health and wellbeing perspective, as I'm sure we'll hear from John. So just over to the panel to introduce themselves briefly, who you are and what your focus area is, where you're from.
Sure, thanks Sharon, and thanks for having me on the panel. My name's Sandro. I'm a medical doctor by training. Grew up here in Australia. I've spent the last 10 years working for the United Nations as a technical advisor at the World Health Organization headquarters in Geneva. Done a PhD in public health nutrition in Copenhagen, and spent 2 years as a researcher at Harvard University, where I was looking at both how we address this rising global burden of preventable diseases known as non-communicable diseases, but also how do we translate the science we have into everyday knowledge and get people excited and engaged, and get empower consumers but also decision makers. And then spent the last 2 years running EAT, the EAT Foundation based in Norway, launching the Eat Lancet report this year with the planetary health diet. At the same time, I co-host a TV show on ABC called Ask the Doctor. It's on Netflix in 130 countries. It is an example, I think, of not perfect, but it's been a really fun example of science translation, and again, trying to take these messages out every week to 800,000 Australians watching the show. Very excited to join you today. In a few weeks' time, I've actually just moved back to Australia. In a few weeks' time, I'll start as the CEO of Vic Health here in Victoria, working with the Victorian government. But today I don't wear that hat. I'm just here as myself.
Okay, thank you. I feel like you should be 75 years old, having done all that already. Does that mean you've been using food as medicine?
Yes.
Thank you, Sharon, and thanks for having me. I'm Augustin. I am a Chief Research Scientist at CSIRO Ag and Food. I'm a chemist by training. Did my PhD at Monash University in the 70s, and since 1980, I've actually been more involved in food across fats and oils, dairy, microencapsulation, and a lot of my work has actually been translated to industry. But I'm actually at the fundamental end, looking from bottom up how we build up ingredients. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Good afternoon. My name is John Leith. I'm the founder of the Medicann Group, which is a medicinal cannabis healthcare company. And one of the divisions of that company is Hemp Oz, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today around diabetes.
Thank you for coming. I'm Rob McGavin, and I'm the co-founder of Boundary Bend Olives, and we planted our first olives in northern Victoria in 1999, and now after a very long and arduous journey, we have the Cobram Estate brand of olive oil and also have Red Island brand of olive oil. So our interest in health is really around the great things that are in extra virgin olive oil, and also the products that are currently wasted products when we take the oil out of the fruit that have a huge amount of nutritional value in them, and how we bring those to market to be more sustainable and less waste and more cost effective.
Thank you. And Rob is also a cover man, just to highlight another aspect to his CV.
Great, thanks.
The Ag Journal that's hanging around. So lots of experience on the panel. So please prepare your questions, because at the end we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A. And so I just wanted to start, I guess, with a general question, building on that Global Nutrition Report from 2017. And one of my favourite quotes is by Karina Hawkes, who was one of the co-authors of the report, who said at the time that the question is not why are things so bad, the question is why are they not better when we know so much more than before. And I think that's a kind of a key question, that we have so much knowledge and, the growth in our knowledge is exponential. What do we need to change to actually make a difference to people's health? You've got the microphone.
I'm unfortunately holding the microphone, so it's a question that has an enormous amount of answers, of course, but I think that there's a lack of understanding of the nutritional value of fresh and wholesome food, and there's very little. Food farmers are basically at the bottom of the food chain, and most of them struggle to make any money, so there's very little margin to educate people on health benefits of fresh and why olive oil or asparagus or whatever is good for you, and what part of it is good for you. And Dr. Mary Flynn, who I've got an enormous amount of time for, who's a USA professor and associate professor of medicine and studies what foods prevent chronic disease and what foods cause chronic disease, made a quote that I often find myself quoting, is that not many people in the Western world are dying from, malnutrition or scurvy, but they're dying from chronic disease. And it's a combination, in her view, of what we are eating that's causing it and what we aren't eating that can prevent it. And it's a hard message, because the people with the margins and the conflicts and whatever, and we've all got conflicts, I've got one myself, would have you believe you need to get everything out of a pill, that it doesn't matter if it's a carrot, but there's huge difference if you grew it yourself or if you bought it frozen or if you bought it in the supermarket fresh. And the level of micronutrients and antioxidants in those different foods, I think, has a huge impact and is not studied well enough to say, if you don't want to take statins for this, you can take this diet and you pretty much probably don't have to take them, or you can delay taking them. And it's just a lack of funding, research and understanding about the real benefits of fresh food and how it's grown and then how it's stored.
Yes. So, yeah.
Well, mine is going to be a lot shorter than that, but that was great. I learnt a lot there. My solution to that answer and problem would be two things. One is to eat less, because our portion sizes are far greater than we need them to be. And also to eat less meat. If people could potentially have meat twice a week rather than 4 times a week, there'd be a huge problem in the world solved today.
Okay, for me it is about informing the consumer about the health benefits of food, wholesome foods, whether it's fresh fruit, but also the alternative of actually having judiciously processed foods to keep in as much nutrients as possible. I also think that when you talk about the availability of foods, we also have to talk about the whole supply chain from farm to consumer, and also to get people across the whole chain, the multi-stakeholders across the chain, to actually understand their part and their role collectively to make foods available, safe, give people choice, and actually develop a trusted voice to make sure that what we say about the food is actually validated in the lab as well. Thanks.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with what's already been said, and I know Karina very well, and so I'd actually challenge her a little bit and say that we also need to be asking why are things so bad? Why are we in a situation where 2 in 3 Australians are overweight or obese, and 2 in 3 of those are deficient in key micronutrients? So in fact, they're macronutrient overloaded and micronutrient deficient. We still have, huge issues of malnutrition in our country. We still have about half the planet being left behind from a nutritional perspective. Hunger is again globally on the rise. and being compounded by these big challenges like climate change and our inability to really rethink the way we consume to make room in our global food system for those 830 million people we currently lock out. So I think actually we still need to ask that really important question of why are things so bad, and what are the levers and the mechanisms, the individuals and the parts of society that we need to actually rethink or address that will allow us to not only develop the solutions, because many of the solutions exist. It's a political economy issue, it's not a technical issue. We know what a diet should look like. We can argue about whether it's the Planetary Health Diet or the WHO diet or the National Dietary Guidelines. Let's stick with the National Dietary Guidelines here in Australia. We still have a long way to go. 19 in 20 Australians don't eat enough vegetables. 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 of our kids are now overweight or obese, and that number's increasing. So I think still having that really important conversation of what are the major drivers of these diseases, what are the influences at the political level that we need to think about and address, how do we reframe, how do we make good food the path of least resistance, because in a world where consumers want and deserve something that is convenient, that is affordable, but is also nutritious, and in a landscape where there is so much confusion, how do we actually go back to first principles and think, what is it going to take in our urban systems, in our food systems, in our digital systems, in our economic systems, to create a situation where in, say, 10 or 15 years' time, once we've been through a very difficult transition where there are going to be, growing pains that we'll need to address and the economy will need to transition with that, and that will take time. How do we get to a point where good food is the path of least resistance for Australians? And we need to start asking those really difficult questions of how do we get there, what is stopping us,
Yep.
and largely, again, it's a political economy question, it's not a technical question. These are not unknown, they're not unknowns, they're knowns, we just don't know how to achieve them. And the quote I remember, which is a member of Parliament I met when I was working for the UN, they said, he said, Sandro, we know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. These are the really difficult things we need to actually work through with policymakers, with business leaders, and then have sufficient time for the different parts of the food sector and all of those that influence to make that transition and also take consumers with us. And that comes back to, again, the public-facing elements and all the important work you do, Sharon, engaging with the public and even events like this, but maybe taking it beyond the halls of the showgrounds next year.
Yes, I don't need a microphone. So there's a role for politics, government, business. We need to do more around fresh food and, of course, the science. So, John, you've got a story, I think, to share around how food can make a difference to health and well-being. So from a product development perspective and a personal perspective, and linking in with the food as medicine, what's been your experience in terms of what you can achieve by changing your diet?
Well, I will say straight off the bat that I'm not a medical professional and I'm not a scientist and I'm not anywhere near as qualified as Sandro's. So I don't want you to be asking me any difficult questions. What I can do is tell you the story, and I'll try and be as succinct as possible. I ended up with type 2 diabetes, and that came on as an absolute shock because I considered myself fit, and therefore it was a rather surprise. When it happened, I realised just how tired and exhausted I actually was. I thought it was stress, and I thought it was from running from one place to the other until I was actually diagnosed. Now, when I was diagnosed, they prescribed me a drug called metformin, and I now know that that's very much a standard drug that the doctors will prescribe. And whilst that, I'm sure, works for most people, it certainly didn't work for me. And therefore, I went back to the doctor, and the doctor had suggested that I actually put a concoction together which included, but not limited to, hemp and kombucha. Now, my eyes lit up because I thought, oh, the doctor's suggesting I can have some drugs. I went, isn't that lovely? And then I realised and learned that hemp is actually a superfood, and I don't, no doubt, need to share with people in the room the benefits of hemp. But that's how it started for me. I then put together the product, and friends and family bought the product, and not bought the product, were gifted the product, and it was coming back with some great feedback. So as the owner and founder of a medicinal cannabis healthcare company, I thought it might be worth to further investigate and do some research and development. So we connect with the university to do that, and did that. And then I went on to the Medicine or Myth show on SBS with Dr. Charlie Teo, and they invested in a clinical trial for the product. And in that clinical trial, it came back that it reduced and reversed type 2 diabetes. And I have to be very clear in saying that this is an early stage clinical trial, but the results were rather overwhelming. And I wish they weren't at times, because since then the phone hasn't stopped ringing.
Well, that's great. This is a good problem to have.
It is a nice problem to have,
yes,
but it's not good when you've got thousands and thousands of people and you're writing down names, and then you get very angry customers because you haven't got back to them.
Yeah. So that's a great example of what you can achieve by offering and creating and innovating around products, and also bringing in the science component of it. I guess for you, Rob, what would you ideally like to see in terms of, I guess you brought up the problem of the pricing around fresh fruit and and vegetables, and there's not as much funding and investment in communicating around the importance of eating more fresh fruits and vegetables and other produce in your diet. What would you ideally like to see?
It's really hard because there's no simple answer, and I don't want to be defeatist before I start, but there's a huge amount of noise out there, and one day it's eat this, and one day it's low fat, high fat, coconut, hemp, whatever. And I'm not saying that it's not right, but the problem is it just becomes very confusing. So I think, and often that the dietary guidelines are just heavily influenced by, people with conflicts, and that clouds it, delays it, so it's often well behind. They're years behind, in my view, where the research is actually at, but just bringing everyone along. And there's been some terrible mistakes in the past around low-fat diets, and just think of how many people that's killed, that sort of statement that you should have a lot less fat, full stop. And it's slowly being reversed. But again, it's pretty simply education, and to put it in a... We were told in our category it's heavily adulterated. There's just extra virgin olive oil is light and pure and 100%, and all these other terms that are adulterated secondary oils that have been heavily processed with heat and chemicals, and extra virgin is the only one that's the natural juice of the olive. Then within that, there's all these different quality levels. So I said to our people in our lab, who do all our quality assurance and testing and research, I said, if our olive oil's so good, how much nutrition's in it? If I went to the chemist and bought exactly the same amount that's already free, what is it? So we did all this, again, research, and they'll sit $9.51 worth of free nutrients in a 750ml bottle of Cobram Classic, which is our purple label biggest seller. So then it was like, okay, what's the average of all of the others without us in it? And it's $3.51. Okay, and this is between vitamin E, squalene, and a phenol mix that you can buy readily in the chemist, just to say, well, Cobram's fresh and really high quality, and you get $9.51 for free if you were just going to the chemist to buy the same amount of nutrients. But if you buy rice bran or canola or refined olive oil, there's basically nothing in it, because it's just purified and gone, and it contains bad things like trans fats and other things. So how do you get the message out there? Then everyone, including my late mother, would say, don't buy frozen vegetables. So I said to the guys in the lab, well, we can measure every antioxidant or minor component, basically, there is in our lab. Here's these ones some carrots and a few other things from our garden, and here's some that I bought at Woolies, and here's some frozen. And, the garden was best. The frozen was next best by a long shot, and the fresh in the supermarket was worse. But if you had got them the very day they were picked, they might have been better. But everything deteriorates and oxidises, and all those antioxidants oxidise and use themselves up. And talking about micronutrients is what we're all lacking. So if you can't get it from your vegetable garden, buy frozen, and Mary Flynn's a big one on this too, which sounds counterintuitive. Obviously, I'd be suggesting you get them from Tasmania and not maybe China, where you don't trust the source as much or whatever. But it's really difficult because we've got no share of voice really as food producers, and these other products are cheap, everyone's busy, everyone's overloaded, so I don't really have the answers. But in our case, we just told everyone who would listen and got them to the groves, showed them the data, tried to put all of the data in one spot through funding a olive sort of wellness institute that sort of brings all the information together.
So that trusted voice and getting the message out is a real challenge, I guess, and a bit of a barrier. Is that a role for the CSIRO, or is that a role for government, or is it a matter of food businesses continuing to raise their profile in terms of taking responsibility and raising and being able to raise their voice by doing the research that you've been doing and using that to communicate with consumers in a more responsible, honest, authentic way?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of work to be done in this space. If you look at how noisy the landscape has become in the last sort of decade with the rise of social media, really the total dismantling of traditional media. I mean, the state of media. Shout out to any journalists in the audience. I just think it's such a tough time to be in media, and fantastic platforms have emerged like The Conversation that do try to give a voice to scientists. That has negative consequences in and of itself, but it's a great and really important platform. And I think that we do need to actually, one of the questions that is on my mind coming back to Australia is how do we actually encourage more evidence-based health content, expert content in that consumers can trust. And obviously we need to look to where, again, going back to why things are so bad, we need to go and look at actually where are consumers currently getting their information. A lot of it's social media, it's Google or wherever else, Facebook. We need to be, maybe it's about working with some of those brands. Some interesting news overnight that Facebook will actually start redirecting searches on the Facebook page for vaccination information to reputable sources, public health sources, rather than simply whoever's the loudest at the time. Interesting change of policy there. Google is asking these same questions. I've been at many meetings with Google, and they're asking the same questions of how they can sort of try to help and curate, but they obviously can't be seen to be directing or manipulating the public in any way, and I think that's fair enough. And how do we do it also? I think there's an opportunity in the media landscape we have. Journalists want to produce good content. We have broadcasters that are looking for investments to be able to bring new content to our platforms. Netflix is hungry for content. Is there a way that we can actually, through traditional funding or through blended funding or through Film Victoria or through government funding or through CSIRO, translational funding, I don't know, get more of this content in a reputable way? I think the Better Health Channel stands out for me as, it's been around for years, but I think that's a really great example of where policy, where government took the responsibility, and I use that a lot with my patients when I was practicing. I still use it a lot today as a reference for people who want simple information. And as an Italian, I'm fully on board the modified Mediterranean diet. If you see how much olive oil I go through in a week, even you might be shocked. But so that's my conflict of interest. But yeah, these are the questions we're asking ourselves, and this is the question that we asked ourselves when we were also making Ask the Doctor is, how do you have to make a show that people want to watch. Why do we deserve half an hour of their time in a landscape where they can get free content from 1,000 different sources? So developing content that is actually for the consumer, that is pitched in a way that's not preachy but is engaging and challenging. What does a war on waste look like, but looking at more mainstream nutrition or our obesity epidemic?
Thanks. Coming back to, the trusted voice, I think CSIRO spends a lot of time making sure that when we produce the products, say for example, I used the case where I looked at microencapsulation of fish oils. This was about 20 years ago. So to get it on the market, consumer understood that fish oils were good. So a small company took the technology and it's gone into all baby formulas over the last 20 years. But we didn't stop there because we needed to show that when the oil is actually encapsulated with food ingredients, in this case, that it was just as bioequivalent as if you were taking a vegetable oil. So basically, the trusted voice comes from hard yakka in looking at clinical trials. So the clinical trials involved first looking at ileostomy patients to see whether or not, how much was actually absorbed. And we knew that 98% was absorbed when it was encapsulated, even within foods. So we were confident. But that wasn't enough. So we then looked at chronic and acute accumulation, how this was actually taken, DHA and EPA was taken up in the blood. So we showed that. And then we showed then, through the clinical trials with our sister Health and Biosecurity Division, that in fact it got incorporated into blood cells. So it's a long path. But the trouble is that companies who want to innovate, right? They're not going to wait 10 years for that sort of result. And so what we're saying is that we look at developing foods, ingredients that are stabilized, whether it's micronutrients from apple waste or whatever, and make sure that the inherent properties are preserved as much as possible. And so when that goes to market, we're just saying that this is a content claim. This contains so much. And if you want to go for a health claim, that's when you have the clinical evidence, and that, I guess, informs how the longevity of your product in the end. And, say, for example, we're also working with the horticulture industry on food waste, which is sort of my area, which we developed about 4 or 5 years ago now. And basically what we are saying to them is, right, you can get carrot powder. And so the question was, how equivalent is the carotene in there? And so basically what we did was, again, with our health and biosecurity colleagues, gave powders. They fed it in a small clinical trial, and we found that it was, in fact, more bioavailable by processing. So in some cases, it becomes more bioavailable. And there are many examples of how phytonutrients, you're saying, Rob, pulling it off the ground is good. If you look at the case of broccoli is also a superfood. The glucosinolates in there, like glucoraphanin, are good. Not CSIRO, but other people have looked at how to increase the level of glucoraphanin. But you talked about metmorphin and diabetes just now. Sulforaphane in a clinical trial has been shown in obese patients at least to actually reduce the incidence of that in obese patients. But the trick is, how do you actually make sure that glucoraphanin is actually converted to the sulforaphane and kept in the stabilized state? John Hopkins has been looking at this for the last 20 years. Now, through fermentation, we know that, you can actually, with a mild heat treatment, increase the sulforaphane, and at the low pH, you actually stabilize it. The next step is to say, does it actually have the benefits in a healthy food, whether it's in a fermented food or the format that you do? So I think there's no shortcut to actually getting the trusted voice. But I can't emphasize enough that, the level of claims that you have to put has to be really honest and up there with the consumer at each level.
Yes. I think Rob wanted to say something.
Sorry, and just the trust is such a huge issue. And when I was saying before about the dietary guidelines sort of being a bit behind or manipulated by special interest groups, it would be farmers like myself, whoever. Yeah. But for example, something that should be completely trusted, being the Health Star rating system, rates extra virgin olive oil, which has been around forever and is probably one of the most researched. In fact, Mary Flynn said that her research from Brown University shows that no food comes close to extra virgin olive oil in the prevention of chronic disease, but it gets like 3.5 or 4 stars depending on which variety of olive it came from, and highly refined, genetically modified, say, canola that's high in anything but saturated fat gets 5 stars, and it's got trans fats, aldehydes, no nutritional value, huge amount of question marks around it. So then all of a sudden, because of one stupid mistake like that, where 99 out of 100 healthcare professionals say, well, extra virgin olive oil is the best because it has the positive nutrition and it's mostly monounsaturated fat, blah, 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 all of a sudden everyone else looks at the Health Star rating system and says, oh, well, that can't be right. Everyone knows olive oil's... it's just to try and change it. We've been years and years from the very beginning putting out information, talking to people. It's just like, oh, well, can't deviate off the dietary guidelines and saturated fat's bad. But, extra virgin olive oil, the fatty acid profile is closer to breast milk than any other natural product in the amount of saturated, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fat. And it has all these amazing things that aren't found in any other food. So it's just like, if basic things can't be changed like that, forget about trying to tell people about, what to eat and how to eat, because that's the really sad and disappointing part, is if you just go and do it yourself, all the interest groups and all the conflicts just smash everyone.
Yeah, I think... go on.
I would like to make a comment on that in terms of the conflicts and the conflicts of interest. Yes, commercial companies always have a conflict of interest because they've got to make profits for their shareholders. But what I will say is that companies that actually put their money where their mouth is in terms of putting money into research and development and to get evidence-based products and evidence-based, scientifically based products tested and tried, you've got to take your hat off to them. I don't know much about the industries that people are in terms of the olive oil industry, but when you're working with medicine, you can imagine that there's very stringent tests, and these can actually take between 5 and 10 years. So if there isn't a commercial nous behind these types of innovations, then there's always going to be a conflict.
Just picking up on the Health Star rating, I think that's an example of what can happen when we let nutrition science drive everything, and that there's two parts to food, or I look at it as and this is from a nutritionist, so I feel like I can say this, there's the nutrition science part, which we often use science to drive our decision making, and we need to be evidence-based. But then there's the heart of food, which is the cultural, the social aspects of food, and I think we underestimate the true power of food by just looking at the nutritional content, and that if we can take a more holistic view, and we can perhaps get better behaviour change in the future. So how much do we let science, with chief scientists from CSIRO on the panel, drive the future, and how much should we be perhaps also incorporating the wisdom of the past, say cultures, Mediterranean cultures, that have been around for a long time, that are naturally connected into food and land, and how do we, I guess, bring all of that with us into the future?
Yeah, I think it's very important. I mean, science is important for the evidence, but I think we live in a world where consumers are used to, the rich culture that people have come with food. And so I was recently on the HRPE for agroecological practices on the FAO committee, and it was about, respecting basically the cultural values of everybody. Yes. Also looking at even smallholders being able to actually have a diverse diet instead of the monocultures which produce one diet. So while tonnages and things like that per hectare of land was important in the past, now people are talking about nutritional yield. And people are talking about how do you actually improve, the whole diet by actually having a variety of diet, but also making sure that you're presenting foods that are culturally acceptable. Yeah. Without that, the consumer, and as you said, Sharon, you got all these guidelines, and everybody's confused. But I think when you talk about food, I think you look at food, and before you actually make a decision, you already know whether you want it or not. It's an innate hormonal response sometimes you have. So you have to look into the social aspects of that and to empower people, especially in vulnerable communities, to actually use their culture and their wisdom to actually guide their food choices.
Yes.
Amen.
Yes.
I mean, first of all, HLP is high-level panel of experts, so congratulations on that appointment as well. It's amazing. And we're lucky to have incredible scientists like yourself in our country. I think it's absolutely the future. I mean, if you look at countries around the world, look at the Canadian guidelines that were just released, you look at the Brazilian guidelines, which is sort of held up as the landmark. There are multiple examples of dietary guidelines around the world that truly integrate all of the social, even screens like technological screens into dietary guidelines, because obviously they're impacting in how we eat and whether we eat with someone and whether we concentrate on the food that we're eating and whether we, what we drink with our food. All of these things impact on how much food we eat, on how fast we eat it, on all sorts of different aspects that eventually influence how that food impacts on our health. So I think I would imagine that sort of is the way that it will continue to move, that certainly global agencies like WHO are now very much realising that the social and cultural context, while it's it needs to be localised and even hyper-localised, it needs to be reflected in dietary guidelines. And it's been a huge evolution, because you have to remember dietary guidelines were traditionally prepared by ministries of agriculture or departments of agriculture. It was the days of we need to grow more food, more calories, protect the food sovereignty of our nation, and not be in famine again. That was kind of the base ambition of dietary guidelines when they started. Now we jump forward 100 years, and it's 100 years. It's not actually hunger that is the major scourge for most of the population, although, as I said, there are still about 1 billion that go hungry across the planet today. It's getting the right food. It's eating less of the wrong foods, the ultra-processed foods. 40% of calories in Australia come from ultra-processed foods. New science that was published last week in JAMA. But also importantly, eating more of the right foods, and I think that's a really positive. So coming back to, how do we get consumers inspired? Yeah. Well, I think we need to have much more conversation around all the delicious, great things that we grow right here in Australia that we can be incredibly proud of, and that we need to be eating a lot more of. Yeah. And in fact, the Global Burden of Disease study suggests that we will probably get greater, if not equal, health benefits from eating more of the right foods, whole grains, healthy oils, nuts, seeds, and fruit and vegetables, as we will from eating less of the wrong types of foods, added sugars, red meat in some circumstances, and ultra-processed foods.
Yeah. Yes, that's great. Well, thank you. It'd be great to go to the floor for some questions. If yes. We've got a microphone. Thank you.
Hello. Firstly, thank you to the panel, and I guess, Sandro, you talked about having a lot of olive oil. I was just wondering if it's Cobram Estate oil. So perhaps... But I guess my question and the touch points of my questions as an Aboriginal man and a grandfather of Tiwi granddaughters has a cultural, political, social, economic lens to it, and I like to frame it with that. You talked about, Sharon, about food and culture and land from Mediterranean and European, but Aboriginal culture been here a bit longer than that, and our foods. And you look at close the gap with the health indicators and type 2 diabetes and other health-related problems which are associated with the processed foods. Then you look at the introduced diet, and you look at the dietary and the medical management plans for a lot of Aboriginal people, which doesn't include traditional food diets. Then you talk about the knowledge around science with gut bacteria and how that relates to diet, and the importance, and I guess the education point that you raised, Rob, around getting the knowledge out there. And like you were saying, Marianne, it takes, or you were saying, Sandro, it takes 5 to 10 years of research to identify what's good for our mobs. Now, people are starting to work out that traditional foods such as the kakadu plum and wattle seed superfoods, all of that stuff, which our mob have always used and eaten and have been good for us, how long does it have to take for that to be put on the agenda for it to be reintroduced back into our communities and back onto our shelves and seen as the proper diet and promoted to others? So I guess considering everything that's been said, and even with the oil, is that all I say, brother? even with the oils like emu oil. A lot of people don't know how good emu oil is, but what happened in the industry was they started to farm the emu and give them the wrong tucker. They were giving them pellets and stuff, but the good emu oil was the ones that the emus was eating with all the good bush tucker. So that's how you extract the good emu oil out of it. So I guess what I'm saying is research, fantastic, dietary. I'm just a broady boy, me. All I'm saying is I hear the conversation, but for a lot of our mob that are still dying for poor health, and diet is such an important thing. How do we get the education? And my brother-in-law, he shared a bit about the wattle seed and that yesterday, another mob with the kakadu plum. But as Aboriginal people who have been saying our bush tucker's good, how do we get you fellas to help to promote that? And I don't know what CSIRO are doing in this space, but I guess that's the lens of my question. Hopefully it makes sense.
Yeah, can I just say apologies? I didn't mention Aboriginal culture when I was saying Mediterranean or that, but my short answer to your question will be that we shouldn't have to wait. Do we need science to tell us what you already know? But
I was going to say we should have had you join us up on
Exactly.
the panel. But yeah, I mean, from my perspective, couldn't agree more. I worked very briefly early in my career up in Mornington Island and Mount Isa and saw some of the very high rates of diabetes very early in life, and it was one of the reasons I actually went into public health. So if I can be of any help ever, you just need to pick up the phone or send me an email.
Look, yeah, terrific insights, and you should have certainly been up here, but I think that it'll be proven that people evolve on their diets, and when you introduce something that's new, it takes, I don't know how many generations or billions of years to change, and potentially, and I've got no proof of this whatsoever, but it makes sense to me that Aboriginal people might do so much better on a traditional diet because they have evolved for 40 million years or whatever on that diet, and their bodies have evolved to that. And I've got no science behind what I'm saying. I'm just saying that it just makes sense. And one of the reasons that, say, trans fats are so lethal for us, it's believed, is that we just haven't evolved to be able to do anything with them. They go through your stomach into your bloodstream, they just float around and can't be deposited anywhere because our bodies have never seen those before, but maybe in 1,000 years we'll know exactly what to do with them. But it's just that evolution thing, and how important are diets to stick to what your grandparents and their great-grandparents or whatever had, what consequences on your health would be if you had more of a traditional diet for where you came from. And to me, that can't be underestimated.
Thank you. How long should you wait? And do we have to wait for the science? Absolutely not, and the time is now. And the perfect example with anything that's ever been created out of innovation is when there's a problem that needs to be solved. And normally the best problems are when you have a problem. So if I talk about, again, my experience, I didn't know about type 2 diabetes. I knew that what I was given didn't work for me, and I then went about solving that problem. So I wasn't waiting for someone to tell me, oh, try this, do that, do the other. You can do a bit of research. It's very easy to do these days. But everything I'm hearing and reading is around personalised medication. And I do know that in the Aboriginal community they're actually better placed to talk to that than I certainly am. And as a company, we'd love to embrace and learn more about what we can use in terms of Australian natural botanics for our products. So I'd love to have a chat with you at some point.
Great. I'm just going to move on to more questions here. Can I just ask for questions to be really short and sharp and one response? Just so we can keep it. I think there's a lot of hands coming up, so one here.
All right, so just to quickly frame my question, I'm 22. Most young girls my age or younger get their health information from Instagram. How do we get people to start getting their health information from the right sources?
Who would like to answer that, Sandro?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are two parts to that, or multiple parts. I mean, first of all, there's obviously a failure of regulation and of government to be able to control the information on our globalised media platforms at a pace that keeps up with how quickly they're transforming. We've seen that in very, very catastrophic ways. We also see that play out in slow motion catastrophic ways in the areas that you're talking about. I think there are people on Instagram that are trying to do really fantastic work. Good friend of mine, the food medic from the UK, she has about 500,000 followers and she's a doctor. She's gone back and studied nutrition because she just started getting so many followers interested in this area. Hazel Wallace is her name. But there are a lot of people with no qualifications at all. And so, I think it probably comes back to we need greater regulation around it like we do in other forms of media. And we probably also need to encourage, or again, how do we fund or encourage, or how do we get social media, young clinicians or people who are qualified onto social media and kind of grow their audience, help them to harness and to tailor their messages in such a way that people actually will listen and enjoy it, or even better, maybe those that already have very large followings on social media. One of the interests I have is, well, how can we work with them rather than advertising the latest, footwear or chocolate bar? Can we actually work with these people who are who have an incredible impression on young people across Australia and are really the go-to source and the trusted voice? Can we actually, upskill them a little bit, enough so that they're not going to be dangerous, and maybe even better, upskill them to the point that they could actually provide some interesting information? We ran a project for back earlier in my career. I ran a project in Cambodia. This is a little bit different, but I ran a program in Cambodia delivering health information through Buddhist monks in Watts, because I realised that the most trusted voice in those communities was the Buddhist monk. And every week the entire community would go there for teaching on various different topics around how to sort of live a life in line with their religion. And we realised that rather than us coming in and delivering health information as WHO or Red Cross or whatever, an NGO, interestingly, the Buddhist monks had some of the highest rates of diabetes in the community because they eat a lot of white rice. It's linked to their culture. But by delivering health information to them, upskilling them enough that they could then deliver health information on, it was actually, we ended up publishing that science, and it ended up being an effective way of delivering culturally appropriate health information. So maybe there are ways that we can use the system we have, but we also probably need some tighter controls to protect young people, yeah.
Thanks, Sandro. Next question, and just a reminder, Sharon's a wealth of knowledge as well, so direct your questions to Sharon as well if you need. Okay, question here or? Yep.
G'day all, Simon here. I guess my question is, and it runs off the first question that went by as well, was as consumers, we are so thrown with sort of all the food and all the knowledge and all the social medias that thrown down it, and you're obviously one with the fats in olive oil and the backlash you probably got from that. What are we as consumers so afraid of to make the change? Why aren't we just going, what's really good for us? More vegetables. Why, what's really good? Why can't we do that? What is it that we're missing that's making it difficult to make that shift?
I can make a comment on... I think that we have let food slip down in our priorities, and I think that I would ideally like to see us elevate the importance of food as part of our culture, and that I think if we we sort of fall into the mindset of we're very busy, do we have time to cook and that sort of thing, and I think that we tend to go for things that are convenient, but that's not always the best choice. It's not always the time-saving choice as well, and that if we let kind of convenience drive everything, I think we're giving away too much. Cooking, serving food, getting people together around the tables, an opportunity to, cooking is an expression of love, receiving food from someone else is an opportunity to be grateful, getting everybody together for connection. I think that if we can raise those elements in the conversation of talking about health and wellbeing and what food can do and the power that food has, that we can raise the importance of that food culture as part of the solution to not only physical health but mental, social health and wellbeing as well.
Yeah, I would just add, I think for a lot of people in our society, the time and economic pressures on their lives today, on two parents working full-time, maybe commuting an hour every day from the outer suburbs into the city to work, and then on the way home they pass 5 McDonald's because we've allowed them to build a McDonald's pretty much on every corner, and the food is artificially cheap because it's subsidised 3 or 4 times through the supply chain, and then every major consequence of consumption is externalised from our current economic model. At the same time, then all of those time and economic pressures make us feel like it would be cheaper and easier to simply outsource our dining if we can afford to. And I think there are still fundamental misconceptions as well. There's good data that actually eating a diet in line with the dietary guidelines would save most Australians money at the checkout, let alone at the hospital bill 20 or 30 years later. But there's a sort of, people think that good food is expensive because we've watched MasterChef for 10 years and unless it's got 47 ingredients, and we've all been to the supermarket to buy the ingredients to make that latest MasterChef food, and it does cost $150. We're buying 37 new ingredients that we'll never use and we can't even pronounce. But actually simple good food, the food that our grandparents were making, minus food insecurity that they faced and a whole bunch of other really major social challenges around that time, but the diet that they largely ate, which is really the fundamentals of a modified Mediterranean diet, is the diet we have the best evidence for. And I think it's a mixture of looking at why bad food, why ultra-processed food is so cheap, and why we continue to ignore and externalise most of the societal costs in the production and consumption of those foods. But also, how do we make good food the path of least resistance? We can't expect, two parents working long hours, driving an hour to work each day, kids going to school, coming home, and then put also the added pressure of, making the MasterChef food from that week. We need to make good food easy. It's about decentralising our supermarkets. Why don't we have supermarkets on the freeway on the way home instead of McDonald's? Why isn't the price... all of the evidence that's come out in the last month about all price promotions, or the vast majority of price promotions and 2-for-1s in our modern supermarkets are for ultra-processed, unhealthy foods. The very things we're eating that are now making up 40% of our diets in Australia, the very things that calorie for calorie seem very cheap, but actually long-term are very expensive, both on us, on our families, on our healthcare and other systems. So I think, we need to really go back to basics and think, how do we make good food the path of least resistance, and how do we also maybe start to question how the different things that we've put in place that allow ultra-processed and junk foods to be incredibly cheap and really in a way prey on the most vulnerable parts of our society.
Great, and we have time for probably one more question.
Thank you. Maybe a difficult question to answer shortly, but do you not think that the time for guidelines and expecting people to change by themselves has gone, and what we need is legislation? In the end, when I get in a car, I have to put on a seatbelt. When I get on a motorcycle, I have to put on a crash helmet.
The answer is very simple, yes.
So how are we going to do that?
But you need to have guidelines. You need to have evidence. Without evidence, it's chaos. So you need to have the guideline. The guideline needs to be evidence-based. It needs to be timely, and it needs to be free of conflict. It needs to be based simply on the evidence that we have. The evidence won't be perfect. It's largely observational. We can have a big discussion about all of that as well, the quality of nutrition evidence. But you need to have... The science needs to kind of set the menu The hard part is not setting the menu, it's getting everyone to eat it. It's the political economy question. How do you actually then implement it? We have dietary guidelines, no one achieves them. So you do need to have them because you need to have sort of the gold standard that you're working towards, and you need to make sure that they are gold standard and free from influence from people with conflicts. That's very important to have, and we need to continue to support platforms like CSIRO, independent scientific platforms that can inform those guidelines. But that's only 10% of the work. 90% of the work is then getting those into the hands of politicians, giving them the coverage to make bold decisions, keeping those decisions in place long enough to get evidence to prove that they work, informing consumers so that they actually they vote that same politician back in next time, and the next politician doesn't go, ain't going there. They're the hard parts. But yes, you still need to have those as a starting point. They're necessary, but no way sufficient.
John.
I think John wanted to say something.
Well, whilst I agree that we should have some guidelines, as a pre-diabetic, if someone was to tell me to eat that and eat this and be very prescriptive about it, I'd probably eat the absolute opposite. So I think what it comes back to, rather than policing it and saying put your seatbelt on when you go in a car, I think it's about your parents in terms of where you start eating good food. And perhaps it's a bit of an example which I'll give you. My colleague, Dr. Frances Henshaw, is in the room today. And she was telling me a story just last night that her mother, she's from the UK, her mother used to give her 2 pence for every time she ate a Brussels sprout. So perhaps we need to look at how we incentivise them and how we get them to actually take the stuff so that then they get the benefit from it.
Mary?
Marianne, just want to add a comment.
I just want to add something. I mean, I think that while preparing foods and all that's very much part of culture, but the path of least resistance is really important, and this is where appropriate food processing can actually help. So an example is if you actually have a vegetable, 75 grams is a serve. If you concentrate that into powder, 2 tablespoons of that is actually a serve. So you can actually, it's called help by stealth sometimes, but you can actually put 20% vegetable in an expanded snack, and so provide that to your kids. So it's about actually being innovative about how you actually have a nutrient-dense product by actually appropriate processing, preserving it. That will never be perfect because, ascorbic acid will always go, right? But you can actually keep, with appropriate processing, some of the micronutrients as well as the macronutrients in the appropriate form. So convenience is one part of the solution as well, provided it's actually healthy and has a nutrient-dense component in there.
Thank you.
Wow. Well, there we are. We're going to wrap that up this session, and obviously lots more questions, but I encourage you to reach out to each and every one of them. They'll be here to have a chat. And Sharon, thanks very much for that panel. Give it up for Sharon and the panel.